Rural Massachusetts wasn't where I thought I'd end up in my late 20s. Yet after my life spectacularly derailed thanks to a breakup that felt more like an exorcism than a separation, there I was, back in my parents' drafty colonial house with creaky floors and a backyard that bled into dense, brooding woods. The countryside's quiet was maddening, every creak and distant rustle sounding louder than it had a right to. Life had taken a turn toward the mundane. I spent my nights patching up drunks and accident victims at the local urgent care facility. Small towns are good at keeping their ERs busy. Between drunken brawls, old machinery mishaps, and the occasional overdose, I barely had time to notice how much my life had shrunk. This was my existence, until one strange night turned everything I knew upside down. It started innocuously enough. My shift dragged on past 3 a.m., as usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and the sterile smell of antiseptic clung to my clothes even after I left. I was exhausted, my hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline after stitching up a teenage boy who'd flipped his ATV. By the time I got to my car, the air outside felt almost sharp in its cold clarity. The gas gauge blinked empty, forcing me to make a pit stop at the Shell station a few miles down the road. The place was one of those ancient, dimly lit stations that always seemed on the verge of collapse. It crouched on the side of the highway, its cracked concrete lot illuminated by a flickering neon sign. I pulled in, stepping out into the silence. Not another soul in sight, except for one car parked at a distant pump. Its engine idled faintly, the rhythmic sound somehow out of place in the stillness of the early morning. As I pumped gas, a man emerged from the other vehicle. He moved awkwardly, like a puppet with tangled strings. His clothes hung off him, oversized and mismatched. A gray hoodie smeared with grime and faded jeans that looked like they'd been dragged through mud. He approached, performing an odd little trick with his fingers. He folded them into impossible shapes, making them pop and crackle unnaturally, as if his joints lacked the constraints of human anatomy. "Hey," he called out, his voice strangely flat. "Hey, miss, look at this." "No thanks," I muttered, glancing away. My pulse quickened, though I couldn't explain why. There was nothing explicitly threatening about him, yet every fiber of my being screamed at me to finish up and leave. I replaced the pump and got into my car without another word, driving off with the man's figure receding in my rearview mirror. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house stood quiet and dark, its windows like empty eyes. I let myself in using the spare key from under the ceramic toad on the porch. The comforting warmth of home welcomed me. I microwaved leftovers, the hum of the appliance a soothing counterpoint to the unease gnawing at me. My parents were asleep upstairs. The creak of the old floorboards was proof enough of that. Then I heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. For a moment I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. The sound echoed in my ears. Slowly I set my plate down and tiptoed to the foot of the stairs. "Mom? Dad?" I called softly. No response. I crept upstairs, heart pounding, and peeked into their bedroom. Both were still asleep, oblivious to the intruder. My dad woke groggily when I shook his shoulder. "Someone's in the house," I whispered, barely able to form the words. He grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed, a habit from when he played in a local league decades ago. Together we searched the house. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, every crevice a potential hiding spot. In the dining room we found him. The man from the gas station was crouched under the table like a grotesque, oversized insect. His head snapped up, and for a moment, our eyes locked. I'll never forget the emptiness in his gaze, like he wasn't entirely there. The next moments were chaos. My dad swung the bat, connecting with a sickening thud, but the man barely flinched. He was fast, unnaturally so, scuttling out from under the table and darting toward the door. My dad gave chase, shouting obscenities, but the man disappeared into the night, leaving behind only a faint odor, like rust and damp earth. The police arrived quickly, their sirens slicing through the silence. They searched the property and found no trace of him. The spare key was gone. In the days that followed, the unease didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin. I started to notice things. A flicker of movement in the tree line outside the house. footprints in the dirt near the back door. The feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. One night I dreamed of the man. He stood at the foot of my bed, his body contorted unnaturally, his fingers twisting into impossible shapes. "Let me in," he whispered. I woke up screaming, the sound echoing in the quiet house. My mom rushed in, her face pale with concern. I told her it was just a bad dream, but the truth gnawed at me. He hadn't just followed me home. He was waiting. Over time, life returned to its strange, uneasy normalcy. The police never found him, and my parents stopped hiding a spare key outside. I quit my job at the urgent care, unwilling to risk another late-night encounter. But even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself glancing over my shoulder, and sometimes in the dead of night, I hear it again. That faint, rhythmic sound of fingers cracking. The highway at night is like a living thing, an endless black ribbon dotted with the faint glow of taillights and the occasional gleam of fluorescent signs. For me, it was both a path to freedom and a place of eerie solitude. I was driving south on I-95, escaping New York's chaotic sprawl for the sunlit promise of Florida. My car, a slightly beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better days, hummed steadily along the asphalt. It was past midnight, the highway stretching out endlessly before me. The air inside smelled faintly of stale coffee and fast food wrappers. That night, the world felt different. Maybe it was the oppressive darkness or the eerie absence of other travelers on this particular stretch of rural New Jersey road. Either way, a faint unease began to creep over me, curling around my thoughts like fog. When the Wendy's sign appeared in the distance, glowing red and yellow against the inky sky, I felt a twinge of relief. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten in hours. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars huddled near the dimly lit building. I pulled in and parked, the crunch of gravel under my tires oddly loud. For a moment I just sat there, staring out at the desolate lot. Something about the place felt wrong, but hunger won out over instinct, so I grabbed my wallet and stepped out. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of rain-soaked asphalt. I glanced around, noticing a beat-up sedan parked at the far end of the lot, its windows darkened. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another weary traveler perhaps. But looking back, I wish I'd paid more attention. Inside, the Wendy's was brightly lit but utterly lifeless. A lone employee stood behind the counter, her face pale and bored. I ordered a burger and fries, opting to eat in the car. As I returned to my vehicle, the unease I'd felt earlier prickled at the edges of my awareness again. The sedan from before was still there, its shadowy outline barely visible under a broken street lamp. I shook off the feeling, climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. It wasn't until I was halfway through my meal that the knock came. It startled me, the sound sharp and sudden against the stillness of the night. I turned to see a man standing outside my window. He was tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. His clothes were loose and unkempt, a faded flannel shirt and jeans frayed at the hems. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "You think you could help me out? My car's dead." I hesitated, my heart thudding uncomfortably in my chest. The man gestured toward the sedan at the far end of the lot. "Just need a jump," he added, giving a sheepish smile. "Battery's dead." Something about him made me wary. Maybe it was the way he stood, his posture too relaxed, or the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Still, I didn't want to be the guy who refused to help. "Sure," I said finally, rolling down the window just enough to be heard. "Let me grab my cables." We walked to his car together, the sound of our footsteps unnervingly loud in the empty lot. Up close, the sedan looked even worse. Rusted edges, mismatched panels, and a faint but unmistakable odor of mildew. The man popped the hood and I connected the jumper cables. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The parking lot, though empty, seemed to hum with an invisible tension. "Try it now," I said, stepping back. The man climbed into his car and turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. "Damn," he muttered, climbing out. He pulled out his phone, speaking rapidly in Spanish to someone on the other end. His tone was clipped, urgent. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the shift in his demeanor. My unease grew sharper, coiling in the pit of my stomach like a living thing. It was then that I heard it, the low, rumbling growl of engines. Two pickup trucks roared into the parking lot, their headlights slicing through the darkness like twin blades. They came to an abrupt stop, boxing in my car with surgical precision. My first thought was panic. My second thought was escape. The man from the sedan turned to me, his face now a mask of indifference. "Sorry, amigo," he said with a shrug. He didn't have to say more. I understood perfectly. I bolted. The woods behind the Wendy's were dense and disorienting, branches clawing at my face and arms as I ran. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each step an effort to stay ahead of the chaos behind me. I could hear them, voices shouting, the crunch of boots on gravel. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I found a hollow beneath a tangle of roots and dove into it, curling in on myself as I tried to quiet my breathing. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer. "Find him!" one of them barked, his voice harsh and commanding. I lay there, paralyzed by fear, as a beam of light swept over the trees, passing just inches from my hiding spot. My mind raced with images of what they might do if they found me. Robbery, worse. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the voices faded, replaced by the distant growl of engines. When I emerged from the woods, trembling and covered in dirt, the parking lot was empty. The trucks were gone, as was the man in his sedan. My car, however, was a different story. The windows were smashed, the contents ransacked. My suitcase, laptop, and wallet, all gone. Only the half-eaten Wendy's burger remained, mocking me from the passenger seat. The police arrived an hour later, their flashing lights painting the lot in shades of red and blue. The officers were polite but detached, taking my statement with the practiced efficiency of people who'd seen it all before. "Fake plates," one of them said, shaking his head. "Probably part of a crew that preys on travelers. We'll file a report, but don't get your hopes up." The drive to Florida was long and silent. The fear I'd felt that night didn't fade with distance. If anything, it grew sharper, taking on a life of its own. Every flicker of headlights in my rearview mirror set my nerves on edge. Every rest stop felt like a potential trap. Even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that night. The man's unreadable smile, the rumble of the trucks, the suffocating darkness of the woods. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving down a lonely stretch of highway, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder. Because somewhere out there, I know they're still waiting. The interstate at night has its own rhythm, a hypnotic pattern of headlights, mile markers, and the soft hum of the engine beneath your feet. I'd driven it countless times, but that night was different. It wasn't just the darkness pressing down like a heavy hand or the eerie stillness of the open road. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. The kind of unease that prickles the back of your neck and whispers in your ear that you're being watched. It was just after midnight when I first felt it. I was halfway through a grueling overnight drive, a stretch of interstate that cut through desolate countryside with little more than shadows for company. My coffee had gone lukewarm in its cup holder. My playlist had long since turned repetitive, and my eyes burned with fatigue. That's when the rest area sign appeared, glowing faintly in the distance like a beacon. Rest area 2 miles. Relief washed over me. My bladder had been nagging for the last 40 miles, and the thought of stretching my legs, even for a few minutes, was tempting. The rest area appeared sooner than I expected. A small, nondescript building huddled under the dim glow of a single overhead light. There was only one other car in the lot, an older model sedan parked at an angle near the entrance. Its windows were dark, and I couldn't make out anyone inside. I parked a few spaces away, leaving my engine idling for a moment as I scanned the area. Nothing moved. No people, no noise except the faint rustle of wind through the surrounding trees. I told myself it was fine, grabbed my phone and keys and stepped out. The restroom was worse than I'd imagined. The fluorescent light inside flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows across the cracked tiles. The air was damp, carrying a faint but unmistakable stench of mildew. And then I saw him. He stood in the far corner of the room, his back to me, motionless. A man. tall, broad-shouldered, with his head slightly bowed. He wore a faded plaid shirt tucked into loose jeans, and his hands hung limply at his sides. I froze, one foot still outside the door. My mind raced through 100 explanations. Maybe he was drunk or homeless or just some harmless eccentric, but none of them made me feel any better. Hey, I said, my voice echoing too loudly in the empty space. He didn't respond, didn't move. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I took a step back, then another, until I was out the door and back in the night air. My car was only 20 feet away, but it felt like a mile. I glanced over my shoulder as I walked, half expecting him to appear behind me. The restroom door remained closed. The parking lot was still empty. But as I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. The man was standing in the doorway now, silhouetted against the flickering light, and he was looking straight at me. I drove faster than I should have, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The interstate swallowed me whole again, mile markers ticking by in a blur. Just some weirdo, I muttered aloud, trying to convince myself. Nothing to worry about. But the image of him standing there watching me wouldn't leave my mind. The way he'd moved, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I should have called the cops, I thought. But what would I have said? There was no crime in being creepy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. It was another hour before I saw the second rest area sign. By then, fatigue had returned with a vengeance. My shoulders ached and my eyes felt like they were lined with sandpaper. I debated pushing through, but the prospect of a quick break was too tempting. This rest area was even smaller than the first, a squat brick building with no cars in the lot. I hesitated for a moment, but my body's needs won out. The restroom was empty when I entered. The light inside was brighter and steadier. A small mercy. I chose the middle stall, locking the door behind me. The silence was almost comforting, a brief reprieve from the tension that had been gnawing at me all night. And then I heard the footsteps. They were slow and measured, the sound of heavy boots on tile. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my stall. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling. No response. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I unlocked the screen and hit 911, putting it on speaker. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. I didn't get a chance to reply. The footsteps resumed, this time retreating, and a moment later I heard the restroom door creak open. Silence. I waited a full minute before emerging, phone still in hand. The restroom was empty, but I didn't trust it. I hurried to the parking lot, scanning the shadows for movement. My car sat alone under the light, but the sense of safety it offered felt fragile, illusory. The 911 operator was still on the line, asking me questions I barely registered. I climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors with shaking fingers. "Stay on the line," she said. "We're sending a patrol car to your location." I didn't argue. The patrol car arrived 10 minutes later, its flashing lights a welcome sight. 2 officers stepped out, their presence instantly reassuring. After hearing my story, they escorted me to the nearest town, where I was able to rest and regain some semblance of calm. The stalker was never caught. The police believed he'd followed me from the first rest area, but without a clear description or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Months later, I still think about that night, about how vulnerable I'd felt, how easily I could have become another statistic. And every time I pass a rest area now, I feel the same cold knot in my stomach. Because somewhere out there, he's still walking, still watching, and I'll never forget the way he looked at me.